So I've got three kids, two girls and a boy, and they've all presented many challenges. But man, I got to tell you, when my boy came into his teenage years, it was a real struggle at times, and he's still in there. And things have been good. As it turns out, he is not alone though, and nor am I. It's been a real struggle for boys in recent years, and today we're going to unpack this with Ruth Whippman, who is the author of BOYMOM: Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. Here's what Goodreads has to say about BOYMOM. As the culture wars rage and masculinity has been politicized from all sides, writer and mother of three boys Ruth Whippman finds herself conflicted and scared. While the right pushes a dangerous vision of fantasy manhood, her feminist peers often dismiss boys as little more than entitled predators in waiting. With young men in the grip of a loneliness epidemic and dying by suicide at a rate of nearly 4 times their female peers, Whitman asks, how do we raise our sons to have a healthy sense of self without turning them into privileged assholes? How can we find a feminism that holds boys to a higher standard but still treats them with empathy? And what do we do when our boys won't cooperate with our plans? Well, today we're going to unpack all that with Ruth Whippman. Please welcome this week's Fresh Face in Hell, Ruth Whippman. Ruth, thank you for being our fresh face in hell.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm really excited about, I'm looking forward to this conversation because I have a 16-year-old boy, super bright,
Ooh.
sensitive, very affectionate, but he's a total live wire. He finds trouble wherever possible. He has a
Yeah,
tendency to isolate. His temper runs hot.
yeah,
It's been a real struggle the last couple of years. I know
yeah.
many other parents of boys who are reporting the same things, but it's interesting when I talk about the crisis among boys and young men. I'm often greeted with kind of skepticism, and yet I see it everywhere. Boys are struggling in school; they're struggling socially. But why does it seem like a large portion of the population don't seem to want to accept this?
Yeah, I think this issue has become so politically coded. I think somehow at some point we sort of decided that if you were broadly on the left of politics, then you supported women and girls and, and boys and men were kind of a side issue that you weren't really worried about. And then if you support boys and men, then you're kind of on the right side of politics, which is such a ridiculous false distinction in my mind. But it's somehow become coded that way. And it's almost like I think there's some feeling in feminist circles of which, I include myself in in that idea of feminist circles. But I think there's this idea on the left that like caring about boys and men is somehow like taking something away from women and girls and from the feminist struggle. And it's a kind of, at best, a distraction and at worst, kind of a slightly bad faith attempt to divert the narrative.
Yeah, and it's well, kind of understandable for thousands of years. It's been, you know what I mean? Nobody's been paying attention to girl. There's been a crisis among girls for
Right,
generations
absolutely.
after
And this
generation.
Right, this stuff is real. And I think, we're just starting to tell women's stories and to listen to women and to believe women and to, advocate for women and girls that people don't want to get diverted off the course. So I think it's kind of got a slight ring of like white lives matter about it, which I think is a mistake. And I think it's the wrong framing. But that kind of like slightly bad faith politicking.
Yeah, I think the pendulum tends to swing pretty wide before it self-corrects these days, and just sort of the state of our political, our political dialogue in this country. It just tends to be way to one side or way to the other. When
Right,
really most of the people I know are kind of somewhere in the middle of that, But
right,
like
for
that's not.
sure. For
But it
sure.
doesn't the media doesn't like that so much.
So
So the
true.
feminist discourse about men and boys, yours, it's changed quite a bit since Me well, just not just let's not talk about yours yet, but, like, the feminist discourse about men and boys has changed a lot since Me Too, which
Yeah.
is understandable, but let's unpack this. You started to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a complicated thing. So I think, this sort of anger that got unleashed at, when the Me Too movement exploded in 2017. It had been building for a while, but I think that 2017 was almost kind of a line in the sand in terms of just like there was this like upswell of women's rage at this like absolute systemic abuse that had been going on in our culture that had been completely normalized, that men had been routinely harming women and women were angry about it. They were ready to fight about it. And that was absolutely necessary. I was, a big supporter of that movement. And I'm so glad that happened. And, sort of really felt at that time that for the first time, women were setting the terms of the conversation, which was really a new thing. But I think since then, there's this kind of micro generation of boys that were kind of reaching puberty around the time that the Me Too movement exploded, so around 2017, who are now of voting age, of college age, young adults. And they spent their entire adolescence in the shadow of this like post Me Too conversation, which kind of cast men and boys as these like harmful predators, basically. That, the whole narrative was about men are terrible, men are harmful, boys are harmful. They're just these kind of like predators in waiting. And I think that's a really, really psychologically unhealthy environment to grow up in. And I think it's done some real damage psychologically and politically to that sort of micro generation of boys.
Yeah, and I don't think it's completely wrong. Guys are I mean, I'm a guy, and I know
Yeah.
guys are kinda creeps largely. I mean, we've got a lot of growing to do, but framing the argument that way is not I mean, I think sort of trying to move these young men towards a positive idea of masculinity instead of attacking them. I mean, especially at that
Yeah.
age when you're so vulnerable as a teenager and you're trying to stake out your own identity and your own
Yeah.
yeah. You
And I
talked
think
about how
oh, sorry.
Oh, no, 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 go on.
No, I was going to say that any identity that's kind of grounded in shame is not really going to be a healthy one. I mean, I think every person deserves to have a sort of blank slate in the sense of, you can be your best self. We're not condemning you from the moment that you're existing. And I think that sort of post Me Too time could have been this like really great opportunity to talk about how these stereotypes harm everyone. They also harm men and boys, that there are so many toxic behaviors that not only teach boys and men to harm other people, but are really harmful for boys and men psychologically themselves. But instead of, unpacking, look, how does this system harm everybody and how can we do better? It was just a kind of pile on of rage and anger.
Yeah, you talked about how the feminist ideology you grew up with was largely based on this idea that gender differences were perpetuated socially, that they
Yeah.
were that they were mostly taught, and I think this was just sort of the conventional wisdom. For Boy Mom, you delved deeply into the researching the hardwired differences between girls and boys.
Yeah.
What were some of the most surprising things you learned?
Yeah, so I mean, in answer to your first point, I very much grew up, I had this feminist mom, and, I had this narrative which was just like the reason why boys and men behave badly is because we allow them to. We just sort of like coddle them. We're like, boys will be boys, on you go, whether that's like hitting your brother or using a Nerf gun, or whether it's like hazing your fraternity brothers when you're older, or like all the way up to like sexual assault. And it was this very enabling narrative. I think that, it's a complicated thing because I believe, and after having dug into the research, there really are some significant gender differences that are rooted in nature. But I think because there's this history where people kind of co opt that for bad faith reasons, I think feminists have been unwilling to kind of accept that in the past. But what I found, which was really interesting, was that some of the sort of some of the differences that are rooted in kind of hormonal and biological things are the ones you would expect, that boys generally do tend to be more physical, they generally do tend to be a little more aggressive, etc., etc. They also tend to be more vulnerable and more emotionally sensitive than young girls, and they need a little bit more care. When a baby
And that
boy
is
is
gonna surprise a lot of people. I mean,
right,
I
and
think
this was
intuitively they think the opposite, that the boys are
right.
impenetrable and they don't care.
That they don't care, that boys are just these kind of simple little creatures. You hear this kind of narrative like boys are like dogs. I don't know if you've heard that
Oh,
before,
yeah,
but it's
a whole
like,
life.
right, all you need is just like throw a ball at them, there's, give them some food, they'll be fine. And actually, boys are extremely emotionally sensitive and vulnerable. When a baby boy is born, his brain is around a month to 6 weeks behind a baby girl's brain in right brain development. So this is the part that deals with attachment, with emotional self-regulation, with your ability to form relationships with your caregiver. And if you've ever held a baby or a baby, a newborn baby, a month to 6 weeks is quite a lot. that's like a big difference. The difference between a 6-week premature baby and a full-term newborn, for example, is a lot. And so I think when a baby boy is born, he needs slightly more help from his caregivers in terms of like regulating his emotions, stopping crying, being soothed, calming down. And again, these are group level differences. This is not like every boy and every girl, but at a group level, this is true. But I think what ends up happening is that big boys are more vulnerable, more sensitive in certain ways. But because of our ideas about masculinity and what boys need, we tend to like project all this masculine thing. And so they sort of need slightly more care, but we end up giving them slightly less because of this narrative. They don't really need it. They don't, they're strong, they're tough, they're robust. They don't need this extra attention.
So, raising 3 boys as a feminist, what were some of the big challenges that you did not foresee?
Yeah. So, I mean,
And the biggest surprises? Yeah.
yeah. So going back, I have 3 boys who are now 15, 12, and 7. But when I had like 3 very little boys in my house, I had really bought into this feminist narrative. I was like, I am going to raise my boy. Boys and girls are only different because we socialize them differently. So, my boys, they're never going to be those like rough and aggressive boys. They're never going to, they're going to be these perfect feminist sons who are going to love, crafts and sitting still. And I'm not going to enable any bad behavior in my home. And of course, that was just complete nonsense. And my boys were the wildest, the most, Nerf gun loving. They loved all the things that were like really challenging to me, all the violent play, all the wrestling, all of the like toy guns, all of the everything, they absolutely loved. And it was wild in our house. I was just like, oh my God, am I socializing them towards this behavior? It feels like I'm trying desperately to socialize them away from this, but it wasn't working.
So, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, right off the start, but do you see a difference in how parents on the right are socializing their boys versus parents on the left? I mean, again, these are broad strokes we're painting with here, but,
Yeah. So I think that on the right, there's more of a sort of buy into this idea of traditional masculinity. It's like, I think on the right is like boys need to be tough. They need to do a lot of sports. They need to man up and they need to kind of squash their emotions. And it's good to, that they see these traits as really positive ones. It's like good for a boy to be tough and aggressive and to learn to fight. And, obviously these are very broad brushstrokes, but, and this idea that a boy needs to kind of man up, toughen up, I don't think many people on the right see that as a positive thing. And I think in doing so, they end up sort of slightly neglecting boys' emotional development. This whole sort of man up, squash your emotions, don't cry, don't be a girl, don't be a pussy. That whole line of thinking, I think, can really have have a difficult impact on boys' like social and emotional development. I think on the left, there's more of a buy-in to like, let's train boys to be more sensitive, more cautious. But I think where parents on the left and like progressive communities often and I think this sort of steps in when boys are a little bit older. I think there's a slight tendency now in progressive spaces to be like, boys, you're so privileged, you're so powerful, everything, you've got everything. You don't, as Richard Reeves, who writes about this a lot, puts it, you don't have any problems. You are the problem. So I think on the left, you've got this kind of shut up, be quiet, pipe down narrative. And on the right, you've got this kind of like man up, be tough, squash your emotions. And I think the effect of it is that boys end up getting shut down from all sides.
I mean, how do we one thing I'm really proud of my boy is, like, listen, I have, he doesn't listen to the podcast, so I can talk about it a little bit, I'm literally talking to his principal, like, every other week. The schools almost seem to overmanage them right now. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
if he's late for class by like 8 minutes, I get a text, I get 2
Yeah.
emails.
It's
If it happens
crazy.
4 times, yeah, I mean, all my kids hate school. And now my daughter is 12. She gets straight A's. She gets anxious if she's like
Yeah.
has an A minus or something like that. I didn't socialize them any differently. She's
Yeah.
just a conscientious. It's just who she is. He was never gonna be the prep school on to Harvard kid. It's just
Yeah.
he's smart, he loves to learn, he just doesn't love to learn in the classroom.
Yeah.
But I feel like and I feel like I'm a pariah as a parent. I feel like such a fake when I'm talking to these school administrators because 'cause they're just like, probably are they thinking, "Is something going on at home? Like, is this kid"
Mm.
but, like, I'm really just way more concerned about his psychic and emotional health than I am his
Yeah,
grades, because there was
yeah,
a couple years there at, like, 13, 14, 15 where he was isolating a lot. His life was very implacable to me. I was worried,
yeah.
like, is he getting radicalized online? And some we weren't having an open channel, and now that's open again, so, like, here I am feeling like, "Oh my god, what a relief." I feel like we're turning some corners. He
Yeah,
tells me everything. He gets in a lot of trouble, but he always tells me everything, like,
that's
that to me,
great.
that's the most important thing, is just, like, open
Yeah.
I wanna know everything you're into because that was the worst couple years of my life. I mean, it put me in the hospital out of anxiety and stress, just not knowing, is my son on there listening to Andrew Tate and being like, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Now I know where he is, and he's really kind of the other way. He's pretty radically progressive, but, like, I'm just relieved, but I'm being treated like I don't know, like my priorities are wrong. I think this is way more important than academic,
Yeah. Academics, I think the system that you're talking about, this kind of like over management of kids, the phone call when they're 5 minutes late to class. I don't know if you guys have Infinite Campus. That's a portal that we have for our kids where it's like you can see their grades update in real time and not just their grades for the semester, but like every assignment you get a grade and a notification. And, we got 3 kids. I think the whole thing is bizarre. I don't need to know that he got 12 out of 14 on his Spanish I think it's crazy, and my husband and I made a similar decision where we're like, and our son has been through a similar journey, maybe it sounds like to your son in some ways, not exactly the same, but and we were both absolutely we're gonna prioritize his mental and emotional health, and the grades are secondary to that, and I think it also is damaging for a student like your daughter who is, like, also really conscientious and getting in this huge, like, anxiety spiral about getting an A minus and whatever. So I think this kind of like over monitoring doesn't serve either type of child.
And what I don't understand is that, I mean, we're talking about middle school and high school students here. They're like, they tell you at the conferences and at the orientations that we just want to teach your kids how to be self-regulate, and we want them to teach
Yeah.
maturity, and we
Right.
want them to learn how to make this. And I'm like, so why are you calling me every
Why are
five
you calling
minutes?
me? Right. It's
Exactly, you know what I mean?
such
Like,
mixed messages. I know. I agree with you. It's ridiculous. I mean, of course, you want to know if they're like really failing in a class or if they're like in serious trouble. But like every test, every quiz, every assignment, every homework is just ridiculous.
yeah, and I don't know. I feel like they're acting like they care so much, but I think that I don't know. That I also know that they're just worried about their testing so that they can get their money, and there's a certain type of
Yeah.
parent. I live in sort of an affluent community. I'm not affluent, never have been, but I grew up in this affluent community, and I took my kids to kinda co-op schools as long as they were available, not private, and I would bring up things like, "Can we lay off the math just a little bit here?" Like, my kids I
Right.
want my kid to I'd be able to communicate with words and write a cogent paragraph. I mean, he can talk well, but, like, I'm reading their papers, and it's like
Yeah.
and I say that, and the parents just give me this stink eye, like, and people are like, "No, but we have to compete in the global economy. No, we have to" they want
I
more
know.
math.
Right, and it's crazy because the global economy, I feel like we can get a computer to do the math at this point, and those, verbal, written, softer, social, emotional skills are the ones that are going to be the most necessary, in my opinion, in this new global economy. Whatever the hell that looks like, none of us know, um, but yeah, I'm with you. I think it's really psychologically very, very hard on kids at the
So
moment.
so I'm gonna move this back to, kinda misogyny here because I remember in the '90s, I was in radio in the '90s, and there was a real vein of misogyny in the
Oh,
media then. It
yeah.
was the age of Tom Likas. Now, Tom Likas used to be this sort of liberal, antidote to Rush Limbaugh. He was like the liberal Rush Limbaugh, right? But then all of a sudden, overnight, he reinvents himself with this platform that is just flat out misogyny. That's it. He's like, "Do you care? Women are bitches. They're just after your money." You know what
Wow.
I mean? It's Flash Friday, gentlemen. And I'm just like, it was just poison because,
Yeah.
his listeners are hanging sheetrock to these 19-year-old kids that have didn't go to college, and they're frustrated with in their relationships possibly, and this guy is just giving them
this yeah, they're
just
giving them
reason
s
to scapegoat women for their lack of, success
yes.
or whatever.
Yeah.
But now, as hard as it is for me, it's even worse than ever. But now it's sort of, I
Yeah.
think, a antidote to Me Too. Now that the that
Mhm.
feminism is pushed back and women have pushed back, now they've really doubled down on this misogyny with this, like, Andrew Tate sorta, help me
Yeah.
unpack this. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's I think that now they're willing to own it more. I mean, I think before misogyny was just sort of this part of the we were just like swimming in it and nobody really identified it as that. So you could say women are bitches and it's just like nobody's saying that's misogynistic. We're just saying, oh, that's a hilarious joke and women would feel gross and, you know, undervalued and all the rest of it. But I think that now we have this vocabulary and so people are calling it out, women and feminists are calling it out. But I think these masculinity influencers are owning it. They're like, "Yeah, I'm a misogynist. Yes, women are." It's almost like a sort of ideological position that people are willing to own and to defend, which is really scary. And the Andrew Tate's, I mean, for Boy Mom, I did a lot. I spent a lot of time in incel spaces
Yes.
online. So I don't know how familiar your listeners are with that, but the
No,
manosphere.
it's one of my lines of questioning, so we can go ahead and move into
Oh,
that
you
right
can talk
now,
about
yeah.
that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, the manosphere is this very weird,
The
sort of
manosphere.
sprawling place. And so the manosphere includes all of the kind of Andrew Tate type influences. And it includes people like incels. And they're quite different in some fundamental ways. So I think they all buy into this hierarchy that there's this thing called this like alpha male that, that is the kind of the Chad, the guy who gets all the girls, they all buy into this sort of hierarchy of masculinity. And then below the alpha male is the kind of cooks, the soy boy, the pussy, the beta male, these like really kind of complicated stereotypes. But the thing is that in the world of Andrew Tate, he's offering out this promise to young men that they too can be alpha males. If they just act like Andrew Tate, if they are misogynistic and they have their fast cars and they do the workouts and the bodybuilding and et cetera, they have this hope to like climb the ladder to be alpha males themselves. It's this false, ridiculous hope, but it's like they're offering a kind of self-improvement plan, a self-improvement aesthetic. The incels are like people who define themselves by hopelessness. So they buy into this same idea. There's this alpha male out there, but they've given up hope that they could ever be that themselves. So they are just like their whole philosophy is based on hopelessness, that they are these like rejects, they're losers, they can't get women, they're ugly, they're short, that in their own estimation. So their whole kind of community is founded on this belief. They call it the black pill, this idea that is just life is hopeless, that they're never going to get any better. And they congregate around that. And there is some like absolutely horrific misogyny on those incel forums. Like just the worst, arguing for legalized rape and torture of women as just a sort of mainstream post that someone will make on a Tuesday morning. There's, just all this violence against women, rape fantasy, just like horrific stuff on page one. You don't have to like dig to find it. But there's also this sort of weird sense of community on there as well that these guys are building. And I think a lot of like really lonely, lost, isolated boys who have no other outlet find this kind of community really compelling there. These guys are kind of supporting each other as well, it's really complicated.
Well, I mean, it is, and it is, and it's also very simple in the sense that that's human nature.
Yeah.
People who act out, people who are terrible people are usually coming from a place of weakness and insecurity
Yes.
and
Absolutely.
not
Yeah.
being loved and not
Yeah.
being and that's, you have to remind yourself that. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, we create serial killers basically to a certain point.
Right.
I mean, a
Yeah.
trip to Walmart, I wonder why is the world such a fucking mess, and then I go to Walmart and I just hear
It's
how parents talk to their kids, "Shut up, don't touch
yeah.
that, get over here."
Yeah.
Like, I
It's
mean,
like this
that's like the
shaming. Yeah.
messaging they're getting all like, that's all they ever get, and so, like, what does
Right.
that do? This person has to put on a shell, I mean, it's getting
Yes.
I'll say this, I mean, my sympathies are so much with women. I was raised by my mom and my sisters exclusively. As a novelist, it has been invaluable to me because I emote or relate emotionally as a female. Like, I'm that guy that will talk about his emotions. It isn't
Mhm.
like implacable, and it's helped me so much because I have to write a lot of, half the characters
Yeah.
I write are female and stuff like that, and my women readers are like, "How did you know that?" No, I'm paying attention. But, like, so my sympathies are like when we talk about any of this, my sympathies still lie with the women, and I think if I didn't have a 16-year-old boy, I might be one of the people I was talking about at the start, which is like, "I don't believe you. There what's this boy crisis you talk about?" But I'm seeing it firsthand, and
Yeah.
I'm seeing how my son will, he acts tough sometimes, but then sometimes he'll go, "I'm such a loser," and, like, he
Yeah.
gets behind in school, and then the train keeps going, and they
Yeah.
just keep giving him homework, and he gets farther and further behind to where he doesn't have the skill set to keep up, and the
Yeah.
school's just leaning harder and harder and pushing him into this corner, and I'm just like I just feel so bad for him, and I think it was
Yeah.
probably like this for women for many, many, many generations. Like,
Yeah,
can we
I mean, I think also it's like we we're sort of seeing it in this sort of zero sum way, that where women gain, men lose, or where women lose, men gain. And actually, we're all trapped in this system together. I mean, this is something that I looked at very much in BOYMOM, that patriarchy harms men. It's like this idea,
Oh,
and I
absolutely.
talked about this idea that, this is something that I wrote in the book, that, under patriarchy, men get everything except the thing that's most worth having, which is human connection and a strong social and a true emotional life, in the sense that they can connect deeply with other human beings about emotional things. And this was something that, and that is the like core of being human. But there are so many barriers to boys and men having that. They really feel they have to be these tough guys, that they can't talk to their friends. They were all like, all the boys that I meet really struggle to communicate with their male peers about anything emotional, anything vulnerable, to be vulnerable. They really feel like they have to put up this front. And it's just reinforced in so many ways culturally, in books, in movies, in the way that parents are with kids, the way that teachers are. It's just this cycle. And so I think that this idea that, everything's a-okay for boys and men. I mean, if you can't fully express your emotions and your feelings, and you can't fully connect with another person about that, then you are losing out on the most important thing. And I think we tend to, it becomes self-reinforcing. We think that, like, the only thing that's important in this world is power, so the fact that women don't have access to power is a real loss. We undervalue emotions and connection, and so the fact that men don't have that, we don't really even see it as a problem because we don't really value it in the first place.
Yeah, as you're talking about that, I realize that this is probably one of the reasons that men don't really read fiction. Like, I mean, 80% of
Yeah,
my audience is college educated women. Men read history, they read biography. I've always
yeah,
sort of framed it as, women want truth, men want facts. But I also feel like I think this is what fiction does, is it explores emotional states in this act of being human and vulnerable and like
yes,
I've been to a million book clubs, right? I show up at a book club and it's almost always women. I've been to like one
yeah.
all men's book club and boy, it was just so different. You go to the women's house and it's like they've got cheese and wine. There may be
Right.
one guy there and it's the husband and he's got the dog on the leash. He's ready to get the hell
Right,
out of here before this
yeah.
thing starts because they could
Yeah,
get uncomfortable. And then I went to one men's book club and it was just a bunch of guys sitting in a circle instead of just sort of casually. Usually it's never a circle, but with the guys, it was very structured, very circle. And they literally just went around the circle. Do you like the book? No. Yes. No. 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 Boo. 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 And it was over. Then the guy turns to me and goes, "So you cycle?" And I'm like, "No." And then he turned away and it was like, I guess my work is done here. That was the whole, there was no discussion about the book.
Yeah,
And so it just really
yeah, and
illustrates to me. Yeah.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, because these things are about, you know, how is it that we get to that, and this was my husband did that. Like, I've been in a million book clubs, and, it's very easy for me as a woman, middle-aged woman, mom, whatever, to access a book club anytime I want to. And my husband was like, "I'd like to join a book club," and I was like, "Okay, well, why don't you have a book club with some dads?" And so they kind of got it together, and they sort of tentatively, like 3 dads, set up this book club. But then they just, like, didn't know what to do almost. It was just like they just didn't know what to do with themselves. So they'd be like, as you say, like, "Oh, so, what do you think of the book? I don't know, it was alright." Or, but they just, like, didn't, it was almost like a skill set that was just missing,
Right.
that they just didn't have the rhythm, they didn't have the, like, access points to sort of have that discussion, and I think it's partly about social permission, it's just, like, embarrassing and it's vulnerable and it's awkward, and also it's just this sort of skill set that you develop over time, having it modeled to you, seeing other people interact in that way, and so, I don't know, I mean, I would not pick if I don't know whatever that experiment is, the philosophical experiment that if you could pick, if you could pick being any type of person, would I pick being a man or being a woman? I'd pick being a woman anytime.
That's good to hear. I would probably pick being a man, but that's coming from a perspective of somebody who had developed those.
Right, you're
That be
already,
ever
yeah,
was modeled to me, and that's one of
yeah,
the reasons I'm really proud of my son, whereas nobody else seems to be, is that I've sort of like I don't wanna say forced, but I've just kind of pushed this and modeled this, like, "You gotta talk to me, buddy. You can't" I know I can
yeah,
see something's bothering you, and you're finally getting to him to open up. There was a couple years there, and this is gonna sound again like bad parenting, but, like, there was about a year and a half where I just couldn't get anything out of him, and then
yeah,
one weekend, we were at the cabin, and, he got into the cooler and started drinking beers, like, when I wasn't looking, and he just got shit-faced. And, it was like he didn't know how to do it, like,
yeah,
he
right.
just went 0 to 60. I mean, he was just like what they
Yeah.
call white girl drunk. I mean, he's like, "Ah!" But it was actually a huge breakthrough for us. So, like, it was a teachable moment, right? So, it was actually a huge breakthrough because for the first time in a year and a half, he opened up to me. He was saying
Yeah,
stuff like it was like truth serum. He was like,
yeah.
"Dad, I'm lonely, I'm depressed," and, like, all this stuff. I was just like
Oh.
it was almost and then he, about puked on me. Uh, but, like, it was such a relief to,
It
like,
just
hear
came
him
out.
open up.
Yeah,
It's like it all came out like this truth serum and, like, it
yeah,
was so since that day, I've been just trying to, I took that as a teachable moment and then, of course, he slept it off, and in the morning, I just tried to continue that conversation a little bit,
yeah,
and he was still a little guarded about it, but I opened him up, and ever since, I just been, like, just kinda,
yeah.
just trying to pry him open a little more, and I just feel like, I don't know, it's hard.
It's so
It's
hard. No, I feel you. I think it sounds like amazing parenting. I mean, not the obviously, your kid. I don't. I'm just talking about the drunkenness thing, but just like the way that you have this connection, and it doesn't matter. You're not valuing him on his grades or his ability to produce something or his ability to be a sort of show pony for you. That you're just like deeply connecting with him as a human being with the actual child that you have, and I think that that will go. So it's very moving to hear you talk about it. I feel like this is, and when people sort of say, "Well, what are your solutions for great
and yet
parenting?"
I
And
feel like a bum. I feel like the bad parent when I go to
no,
these
I
PTO
think it's
meetings and there's a
wonderful because, like, people are like, "What are your tips and tricks for parenting boys?" And I'm like, "Look, there's no tips and tricks. It's just the relationship you have as your authentic self with the actual child that you have in front of you, not the one you wish you had or the one that you think you might be able to create with the right tips and tricks or the one that you're hoping that they'll become in the future, but the actual human being that's right in front of you and looking at them and saying, what does this person need? Who is this person? What do I love in them? What do I value in them? And and how do I give them what they need? And that is, it's like this very, very fundamental act of care and connection. So I think it sounds really profound and wonderful what you're doing, honestly.
Oh, I appreciate it. I mean, I'm finding new ways to fail every day, but boy,
Well,
here's
we
the
all are. I
thing.
mean, look, I'll join you there. I've been thinking a lot about the role of alcohol, actually, and all the disclaimers. Do not give your 13-year-old son, get them drunk in the whatever. But I grew up in the UK, and it's a really big drinking culture there, or it certainly was, and I'm not sure exactly what it's like for teenagers now, but everyone started drinking very, very young, and we drank a lot. We drank at parties. And I think that, there are obviously many downsides to this, and addiction and alcohol abuse and all of that is a terrible thing. However, I think it did have an effect on male friendships. I think it was really, there were so many barriers, to men being open and vulnerable with each other, and boys and adolescent boys especially, and I think alcohol really smoothed that path, and I think it cemented friendships, and there was pub culture, and there was a place for men and boys to
Yes.
go and find their friends and be together. And now, alcohol use has like really gone down with this generation, with Gen Z. They drink a lot less, which in many ways, is good news, whatever. But I think it's actually really caused a big barrier to like male friendship and especially dating and romance. I think this generation is hanging out less with their friends than ever before.
Yes,
And
for sure, and
they're
that's
dating and having less sex than anybody before. And obviously, again, all the disclaimers, I think alcohol abuse led to a lot of sexual violence, a lot of like really blurred situations that were really complicated. But at the same time, I think it's just sort of paralyzing people as well that there is no, I think that there were benefits to it too in terms of like smoothing, and especially for men and boys who had this like so many barriers to like connecting on that deep emotional level, to being vulnerable. And I think you saw it with your son that it kind of unlocked something, and I think that's true with boys and men and their peers as well.
completely. I mean, it's a trope with the guys, like,
Right.
I like by the time the game's over and it's getting real
Right.
late at night, it's like, "I
Yeah.
love you, man. I
Right.
love
I
you."
love
All
you,
this
Matt.
stuff that
Yeah.
all the stuff they say, and again, I think you bring up a good point. You gotta be careful. I know I'm actually relieved to hear you say that because, I mean, I think alcohol, I mean, it can be a good social lubricant or whatever,
Yeah.
but as far as the plenty of damaging things can happen, but, like, just this idea of gathering, like, you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Right.
This gathering at the pub instead of just it's not the same when they gather online and play video games. I mean, it's
It's not the same
something.
at all. Right. It's something, it's not nothing, but it's like, it's not the same at all. And it's not giving people the same benefits. And I think, you know, it's a tricky one. And, we don't want to oversimplify any of this. And it's not just like throwing a bunch of like vodka shots and let them go. But I think
I think
that
this
it,
generation could drink more, and I think
maybe
they could
they
have
could drink
more
more.
sort of
Yeah.
random
Yeah.
experiences. With my son, though, he needs to learn, like, I kinda got the actually, I shouldn't talk about it, but anyway, some people got the "fuck it" switch. You just gotta watch out for that. I mean, there's
Yeah.
the alcoholic
Right.
personality that's like, if you see
Yeah.
them making decisions that they don't make or they changes their personality, there's certain people that just can't do it, but as a general broad sort of social
Yeah.
thing. I think this generation should be having more sex, more random occurrences, more,
Yeah. Right,
I
because
no
it's
wonder
that
they're
feeling
depressed.
of, right, exactly, it's that feeling of you go out and you don't know quite what's gonna happen, and you go to a party, and then you're like, "Oh, we'll go to someone's house, and then we'll just, like, meet a new person," then you have a ridiculous conversation with somebody that you've never met before, and then that leads to another thing, and, it's just that sense of life being a bit more open and free, that, and now instead, that online, they're meeting all these, random, my son came back and is like his best friend. He's like, "Oh, he's got a girlfriend." And I'm like, "Oh, who is it?" Turns out it's a girl in Russia, who may or may not be a teenage girl,
It might be a
maybe
chat bot. I
might be
mean,
a chatbot, might be a, a warlord, might be, who knows? But it's just, I'm like, is that actually better? He's safe in his bedroom. He's not, he's not going to come to any like material harm. But at the same time, that seems psychologically not as healthy as.
yeah, I keep coming, there's so much sociological stuff in the book and so many, but I just keep coming back to the parenting because I connected with your personal story about like just the challenge of raising kids, and I've noticed just how different it is for a parent now. Like, I know for a fact my parents didn't take it all personally. Like, you
Oh,
know what I mean?
same. Yeah.
We came home when the sun was down. They didn't
Yeah.
ask questions. They didn't like
Yeah.
I take my son's my daughters, everything's so personal. Any slight they might have at school or if
Same.
they get cock
Totally.
blocked,
Yeah.
they're not
Right.
invited to a slumber party and 3 other
Yeah.
girls are, and like that,
Yeah.
their pain becomes my pain.
Yeah.
I don't
Absolutely.
we don't I don't think it's always been that way. I
No,
think
it hasn't.
socially we've changed it. Well, what changed?
Yeah.
Why
It's
are we that way? Why do we take it so personally now?
yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think lots of things have changed. I think our ability to like track and monitor our kids has like risen. I think there just wasn't a way that you could track your kids in that like micromanaging sort of the minutiae of their day. So, we have all our kids are on, you know, It's crazy, but, like, our 2 youngest kids have trackers in their school backpacks, and my oldest one has a smartphone, and we know where he is. At any point, I can look at my phone and be like, "Oh, he's there," or he's. So I think the technology has changed, but I think something you're right, something fundamental has changed about what we see our role as. It's this idea of concerted cultivation. I don't know if you've heard of this, but
Right, yeah, I am familiar with the idea.
yeah,
Do
it's
you
sort
think
of
it's
this.
the media? Do you think it's the media telling us that the world is a more dangerous place when in reality, in some ways, crime has gone down? I've
Yeah,
seen studies where it's
absolutely.
like
So I think fear in terms of like material safety and, in terms of kidnapping, all of those kinds of things. I think that, yes, the media has sort of pushed a narrative that our kids aren't safe and we have to protect them all the time. But I think there's also something has changed fundamentally about the idea of our own role, not just in keeping them physically safe, but just, what kinds of outcomes we can expect, that if we do everything right as a parent, then we can kind of create this child that's going to fulfill all our dreams and ambitions and their own dreams and be able to
and then they're
compete
gonna
in the
hate
economy.
you when they're
And
like
they're going to
20
hate you,
yeah.
right? And it's like, I think there's something about it that's really, really damaging. And I think we're often, as parents, using our kids to play out our own dreams and fears and insecurities and whatever. And we think, maybe my kid can be all the things that I wish that I had been, or the things that I felt like I had to deliver and I think, I don't know, it's a complicated question, but I think we have gone way too far. I mean, maybe there was a little bit too much benign neglect when I was a kid, but now I think we've gone way too far the other way, that parents feel like they have to absolutely micromanage every aspect of their kids' lives.
Yeah, like, I don't feel like I have to, I just can't help myself. Part of that is that I'm just
That's
an empath and I'm just so
true.
deeply
Yeah.
deeply, invested in them, but the only time I feel that social pressure is, like, when I'm hearing from the schools and I'm like, "Oh, they must think I'm a shitty dad because my kid's getting Fs," or something like that, but, like, then I got you telling me I'm a good dad, it's just like all these mixed signals.
What is it? Yeah, I know, and it's really I think we also just have way more information than we ever had or previous generations ever had. It's just like online, there's always someone with a parenting opinion or a this or a that, or a method or a book or a course that you can sign up for or this or that. And I think, having that level of information rather than sort of seeing what those around you are doing and then just kind of either replicating or rejecting it. I think there's this idea that it's like a test that you can study for parenthood.
So, I'm gonna come back to the sex and young men's,
Mhm,
their experience with sex. So, and you've interviewed so many boys about
mhm.
sex and relationships too. Let's talk about both of those. But
Yeah.
what patterns did you see? What did you learn when these boys opened up to you? What was their what did you learn about them about sex and relationships? I mean, you handle that in two different.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to sex, I think the like top note, well, the two things that were really just really out there was like these guys are all terrified. They all absolutely terrified of being accused of something or of overstepping, of cancellation, of, anything that in the sort of idea that they might accidentally assault someone or be accused of assaulting someone. And I think that was something that I had not anticipated, but it makes complete sense. Of course,
Yeah,
they grew
no,
up in this
yeah, that
climate,
does make sense.
and also, often their fears are very well founded. There are many, many cases of this happening, and this kind of guerrilla justice that sort of happens online, this cancel culture um, whereby kids take it into their own hands to like accuse somebody of sexual assault or sexual harassment or whatever online in public with no recourse. And being accused of something is the same as it happening,
Yes.
and it's just these Instagram pages, they called them like cancel pages that, you could see your name and it would just be, there was very little nuance. So it would be like somebody who sort of, um, raped somebody was on the same cancel page as somebody who had sort of like put his arm around a girl when she didn't want it in the cafeteria, and it's like, I'm not saying that any of those things are great, but they were flattened into one thing. So I think these guys are terrified. And it's this sort of weird combination where they were still very much held to the sort of old standards of masculinity. So they were, on the one hand, I think girls and many other people still expected them to like make the first move, be dominant, be aggressive, be masculine, traditionally masculine in relationships. But at the same time, if you overstep by the tiniest little smidge, then you can be cancelled, you are accused of sexual violence, etc., etc. So I think that they were sort of didn't really know how to act. It's like, should I be dominant and aggressive, or should I be, extremely cautious and sensitive? And I think often it wasn't so much the actual behavior, but just like who was doing it. Like, I think, a lot of people, like if one guy is dominant and aggressive, that's sexy and hot. And if another guy does it, it's creepy and weird. And these are boys who have been socialized, or have not been socialized in many ways to read like subtle social cues, all the stuff you're talking about when you're talking about being an author and men not knowing how to act in a book club. Boys and men do not get the same education in their like real nuances of reading social cues, in like tracking another person's emotions, in just sort of being in a sort of social environment and reading body language, etc., etc.
Yeah, like mansplaining. Like,
Mansplaining, right, it's just like you're not reading something, and so it's like they haven't been adequately trained. They're held to 2 kind of completely contradictory standards, the masculine dominant one, and they're like, "Never overstep or you'll be cancelled." It's really hard, so they just sort of felt like they didn't know what to do. They were completely at a loss, and so it's never been harder in many ways to kind of navigate that in the real world, and it's never been easier to avoid it by just like watching porn or going online or going on Discord or all of these, online platforms. So I think a lot of boys and men were just becoming incredibly avoidant of sex and relationships in the real world. And they would just rather watch porn. It's too fraught. The risks are too high. The potential benefits are too low. And it's just easier to just avoid, avoid, avoid. So I saw, it was fear and avoidance were the 2 main things, which then led to loneliness. I think a lot of these boys and men were desperate and would have loved to have a real world relationship, but were like terrified.
yeah, for the same I could see the fear of being accused is more of a, like, first time sorta trying to meet a girl, one
Mhm.
thing leads to another, a couple dates, and but with, like, the relationship long term, do you think there's something missing, some missing ingredient
Mhm.
to it's not we've reached a point where, like, the marriage kids are not being married as much. Zoomers aren't gonna marry as much. They're
Yeah.
not gonna own houses. There's not gonna be the
Mhm.
expectation has changed. The expectation was always as a teenager, maybe you get your first girlfriend in high school or maybe
Yeah.
college if you're a late bloomer now. How has the expectations for them changed? Because, I hear Scott Galloway talking about how, the average 22-year-old boy is gonna swipe left 2,500 times to get a cup of coffee
Mhm.
or whatever, like,
Uh-huh.
how do you
Yeah.
think that this expectation of what used to be inevitable, like, I'm going to find
Yeah.
a partner, somebody who, I have something in common with, and I'm gonna have a girlfriend, and, like, w how is this expectation affecting it?
Yeah, so I think that the social expectations have changed. And I think, look, now there's just this like overwhelming amount of choice. I mean, it's not real choice, but this idea that you can have, you can dial up your AI girlfriend to look exactly as you want, and you never have to endure any discomfort. And, there's any kind of porn at the flick of a switch, and that you don't really have to, there's no friction, So I think there's this idea that you can have infinite choices. So this idea that, yeah, you'll just kinda marry the girl next door and start a family and have a life, I think can feel like, I think this generation is extremely overstimulated with choice. So this idea of this very ordinary life path maybe doesn't sound as exciting or fulfilling on the face of it. Um but then also I think that this generation of kids in general, but especially this generation of boys, haven't learnt those skills of like long-term relationships in a way, those skills of friendship, those skills of connection. These are skills that you can build up, tolerating a certain amount of discomfort from another person, you know, realizing that you have to meet somebody else's needs, and that, you have to not just like exactly what you want in any given moment, which I think, internet self-gratification can give you. So I think it's this and then the fear and avoidance. So I think it's like layers and layers of like entitlement, inadequacy, fear, et cetera, that's sort of building up to not make those real world relationships feel possible in the same way. And then economically, this idea that you can just like meet someone, get married, start a family, buy a home, that era has gone economically, I think.
God, the boomers had it so good.
They did. I
Single
know.
income, you could
Yeah.
send your kids to college, you could own a home, you could even,
Right.
stake them to buy a home of their own, you could put away
Yeah.
10% of your salary
Yeah.
for savings.
And I think that a lot of them just don't realize how hard it is. I think there's a lot of shaming of younger people going on, but I think, they don't realize that they were in a situation where if they worked hard and they saved and they made the right choices, that it would actually be meaningful and would lead to something. And I think that this generation can make all those same choices and it leads to nothing. It's still not going to work.
So since we've been talking so much
Mm,
about the crisis with boys and the struggles with boys now, I want to turn around and look at the other side of the coin and talk about how it's gotten better for girls. And I do
mm,
see it. They're just across the board academically achieving
yeah.
better. I see, like, let's talk about some of the
Mhm.
reasons.
Well, I think there was like, I think look, we've made huge strides in terms of feminism, which I'm absolutely, I've devoted a lot of my life and career to supporting these and advocating for them. I think it's wonderful. We've developed a really strong cultural narrative. So now I think that people are able to see and pinpoint sexism in the culture and call it out in a way. Like if you go back and watch like old movies and shows and stuff from the 90s, you can see the kind of sexism that was like very normalized back then, back when I was a kid or a teenager.
God, I
And
remember that Jack Jones song, "Wives Should Always Be Lovers Too." Like the
right.
husband's like
Yeah.
coming home, driving home from work, and the wife's supposed to be in the
Yeah.
girls, put on your makeup,
Right.
la la la.
Get rid
You just been changing
Absolutely.
diapers and cleaning all day, and you're
Yeah.
supposed to
Now
get to
you
the
gotta
door and
like look nice.
wear something off the shoulder. I mean, the
Yeah.
expectations were just so.
We're crazy. And, like things to do with diet culture, things to do with like, oh, girls can't do that. The Barbie doll that's like, math is hard. Let's go shopping. And I think that like now we have a kind of vocabulary and a way to talk about these things as women and girls. Like it's certainly not fixed. And in many ways, there's this huge backlash and we're going backwards. But I think we have the kind of language to talk about it and to pinpoint where we went wrong. We have like, this sort of solidarity with girls' empowerment. We have tons of programs to help girls with things like getting careers in STEM or like doing better in math. There was this whole thing of the math gap. It used to be that boys did
Yeah.
better in math and girls did worse. But there were tons of interventions, and it became really socially unacceptable to be like, oh, this is just nature. Girls can't do math. It was this idea that oh, maybe girls don't do as well at math because they feel like it's going to come at a social cost, or because nobody's encouraging them, or because there's stereotype threat, or there's bias, or there's this, or there's that, social reasons. So there was all this effort put into closing the math gap, and that's happened now. The girls do as well as boys on math. Boys still lag behind girls in reading, but instead of saying, oh, these are so we can, you know, do programs to help boys with this, and there's maybe stereotype threat there, and there's maybe cultural bias, and there's all the rest of it. We're kind of like often quite essentializing in the way we talk about boys. So it's just like, oh, they don't really like that stuff, or it's just the way they are, or it's just nurture, it's just nature. And so, um, yeah, I think that maybe we would do well to borrow from some of that language and some of that thinking and some of that sort of inspirational sky's the limit thinking that we did with girls and apply it to boys.
Yeah. Is there a female analog to the Chad? I mean, I guess in
The
prior
Stacy.
generations, we would have said, "Yeah, right. Okay, Stacy, tell me about Stacy,"
Yeah.
because it's different than Barbie. It used to maybe be
Yeah.
Barbie, but Barbie is now changed. So Barbie is more
Yeah.
affirmational, like stronger, and Ken
Yeah.
is not Chad. Ken is
Ken is
like,
not Chad. Ken is
no.
like beat him out. Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's part of the thing. So I think the thing about Stacey's this very poorly drawn character because she's an invention of the incels who don't really believe that women are people anyway. So I think you're never going to get too far with like, what does Stacey really feel? They're not like worried about her. But I think Stacey is just there purely to be an attractive woman that the Chads get, you know? She's not really a person in her own right in that conception. But I think that now we're doing all these role models for young girls. It's like, be a scientist, be a superhero, be a mighty girl. If you go into the bookstore, there will be 1 million books that are like, you know, whatever, the scientist girl, the superhero girl, the Supreme Court justice girl, this sort of very empowering narrative. And I think understandably we're like, oh yeah, boys, they know they can be the president because every president ever has been a boy. So, but there's less of a push to um sort of create inspirational narratives for boys in the places where they have lost out. So, being a good friend, being a good a nurturer, being, those kinds of roles, the kinds of careers, say, that draw on softer skills, so there's less of that language, I think, for boys. It's starting. I think that we're doing, there's definitely a start, but it's at a much earlier and cruder stage, I think.
It seems like boys think that women are holding him to these masculine standards in some way, but are they? Because women don't really want Chads, I don't think so. Like,
No, I think this is a really complicated one because I would love to be able to answer this question and be like, no, women don't want that. But I think there is evidence that women do hold boys and men to standards of masculinity which are like harmful for them. And I think that's what makes it so tough because they're often saying, women want us to be that way. And I think, there was this really interesting study that I looked at about choking. Do you know this? So young people.
asphyxiation, I read sexual
Asphyxiation, right. And
yeah.
so this is like a sexual practice which has become
Yeesh.
incredibly common, which is
Jeez.
with young people. It's like just a very normal part of sex. It's not seen as like a weird fringe thing. This is just a very, very normal thing. And I think a lot of people assume that this is something that boys want and that girls don't really want, but girls are kind of going
Well,
along
I
with
could see why you'd make that
that assumption, right?
assumption. I
But
don't wanna
yeah,
be choked.
absolutely. But then you look into the data. There's this researcher called Debbie Herbernick, who's a sex researcher. She focuses on college kids and their sexual practices. And what she found was it was actually a lot of the girls, the young women, who were saying, I don't want a man who won't do this to me. If he doesn't choke me, he's not masculine. He's not like dominant, like he's not a real man. So they were like holding these young men to these standards. And a lot of the boys and young men were like, oh, I don't really want to do this, but I feel pressured into doing it. So I think we've got these
Well, I
very,
mean, and then like what you mentioned earlier, they gotta
right,
feel about being canceled and everything like that.
right,
If somebody
exactly.
that's
Like
like
what I,
entrapment, like, "I want you
right,
to choke
exactly.
me," and then,
And then I'm gonna, and then it goes wrong or whatever. I've decided I don't like it or
I
I
don't know how
realize I
that one
don't.
even goes right. How does
Yeah,
that I
right. Or
guess
it goes right. Right. Absolutely. And it's a minefield to navigate. And so I think, this is really, really complicated stuff. I think that we have these old tropes, which are like boys are only interested in sex and power and dominance, and they don't care about love or relationships. And girls are only interested in love and relationships, and they don't care about sex. And, they're just using sex to kind of secure a man or whatever. These are these stories that are basically unchanged since like my grandmother's day, but we're applying them in new ways, but they don't actually represent the reality. Like so many boys that I spoke to were desperate for a loving relationship. They would have loved to have a girlfriend, someone that they connected to, and they felt like they weren't able to do that for whatever reason. And many young women were like finding their sexuality and wanting to have a lot of unusual or casual sex or to watch porn or to do all these things that we associate just with boys.
So we're winding down, and this is a fresh face in hell. So I'm always trying to look for some sort of positive or solution oriented
Yeah.
thing to
What
end
the
on.
hell do we do?
What
Yeah.
does a what is a let's talk about what does a positive masculinity look like that is appealing to women too? Because as you said, there's some surprise data there. Like
Yeah.
women do want this sort of
Yeah.
dominant man at times, just like the old trope about women want a bad boy or
Yeah.
and then what does a positive masculinity look like that could be both attractive to females,
Mhm.
but also constructive for the male psyche?
Mhm. I think that, I mean, look, I can't speak for all women. I don't know what they want, but I think that, in general, humans want somebody who's competent, who's confident, who's happy in their own skin, who's able to relate emotionally and socially. I think by saying women want a masculine man, they don't mean they want a kind of, emotionally inept child. They want somebody who is confident in their own abilities, who's able to care for another person, who's thoughtful, who, and is competent in a range of areas. So I think, um, and I think that's not really so much about masculinity so much as just being a well-rounded human being. I think all human beings need um, both like emotional literacy and power and agency and connection with other humans. And I think if we sort of slightly take the gender out of it, and instead of being like, oh, well, girls have to be this way and boys have to be this way, or masculinity or femininity, it's just like, let's look at all these human traits as being crucial to a functioning adult, and let's not divide them up by gender.
Yeah, like, I would think I mean, I would think to me, and this is based on I mean, if we were to subvert this idea of domination or whatever,
Hmm.
this super
Yeah.
alpha male, and subvert it into like, this is why my wife finally fell for me. Like, when we were dating, um, she was a little younger. I thought I was having a midlife crisis. She was 12 years younger, but it actually made perfect sense because I was like I had 7 unpublished novels, and she's like, "Oh, cool, he writes novels." Whereas if she was my age, she's like, "Yeah, it's maybe time for this guy to start, looking for a
Right.
job in advertising." And also her biological clock wasn't tick, tick,
Yeah.
tick, tick, because I'm like 35, she's 23 at the time. But she said when she really realized that she wanted to be with me was I used to be a caregiver. And when she went on a road trip with me and my client, Trev, who I wrote about in the revised fundamentals of caregiving. His real name's Case. But when she saw me in that light, she saw me protecting and taking care of like, to me, that should be, like, the masculine ideal. I mean, it
Mhm,
should be the ideal for everybody, but
mhm.
it's one I think you can frame in a way that I mean, to me, that is power. If people are
Yeah.
depending on you to protect them or look out for them, if you're I mean, that seems like, that seems
Yeah,
like a
I
good
mean,
place to
it's sort
begin.
of this weird thing where I think, like, some of the tropes of masculinity get in the way of
The male nurse.
right,
Yeah, right,
yeah,
right.
of masculine, and so it's just it can trip over itself. But yeah, absolutely. I think, a man or any human being who can step up, take care of the people in their life, to connect deeply with other humans, enjoy life, become competent at what they do, and are prepared to take on the role of an adult. I think that's, where we should all be aiming.
Yeah, emotionally supportive instead of the
Yeah,
traditional financially
right.
supportive or something. Well, Ruth,
Exactly.
it's been a pleasure. I appreciate you being our fresh face in hell this week.
It's been a
Um,
real pleasure.
yeah, I really appreciate your candor and your openness about parenting, and I hope I didn't get myself in any trouble with my own candor. But nobody under 50 listens to podcasts, so we're probably going to be all right. She is Ruth Whippman. Please find the book "Boy Mom," reimagining boyhood in the age of impossible masculinity. Uh, Check it out, Ruth. You've been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being our fresh face in hell.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.